Welcome back. Now, there seems to be no light at the end of Eskom's tunnel. The power utility is burning around 2 million litres of diesel a day, causing rotational blackouts to manage the reserves. The power utility's CEO, Andre de Ruyter, says the country has a lack of generating capacity. To speak to us more on this is energy expert Chris Yelland, who joins us now virtually. Mr. Yelland, last week the COO, Jan Oberholzer, actually during the course of this week when they suddenly moved us to stage 4, said Eskom is burning a lot of diesel and its open cycle gas turbines. Can you just explain to someone like myself, a layman, what does this mean and why does this have to affect me?
Yeah, these open cycle gas turbines, some of which are owned by Eskom and some of which are owned by independent power producers, are intended to be what is known as peaking plant, to operate for very short periods of the day, maybe half an hour to an hour at the very most, just to see one through the evening peaks, which generally occur in winter. The problem, of course, with so in general they are there for peaking capacity as well as for emergency reserves. The trouble is they've been running as emergency reserves for very extended periods, sometimes 8 hours or more a day, which is what they were never intended for. So they consume vast amounts of diesel, which is really expensive, especially as the prices have been going up recently. And the storage tanks were never designed for this kind of volume. And so it's necessary for Eskom repeatedly to replenish its diesel stocks in the tanks at the power stations. And the unfortunate thing is that all this diesel is imported because the local refineries are declining in terms of their refining capacity. Some of them have come off stream, never to be put back on again. And so South Africa never intended to have this kind of volume of diesel for Eskom. And the diesel that was refined in South Africa was really intended for the transportation industry, trucks, buses and tractors and things like that. So all of this Eskom stuff is imported. And of course, now you are in the hands of shipping. So ships don't come in every day, they might come in once a month or whatever. And if one uses far more than one expects in a particular month, you may run out of diesel in the South African market. And then you have to wait for the next ship to come in, and that's exactly where we find ourselves now. Eskom have said that they're waiting for the next ship, and they're hoping to speed it up, but there's not much you can do about speeding up a ship. You can perhaps sort of minimize the amount of delays at the port, etc., for unloading. But when you're in the hands of a ship, you're in the hands of a ship. You wait for it to come in.
So is this not then caused by a lack of infrastructure maintenance? I mean, the other thing that De Ruyter said, or Oberholzer said this week, was that another big problem they're facing is boiler tube leaks. I mean, these are at substations that were supposed to help us in this day and age, ever since the warning back then. So it seems to us things are getting worse. We're expected to accept load shedding every single day now.
Yeah, so look, we've talked and been talking about maintenance and load shedding for the last 15 years. The load shedding started in 2007, 2008. And intermittently, it's been happening ever since. In the last 3 years, it has been getting progressively worse year by year. So in the first 18 weeks of this year, the availability or the performance of the Eskom fleet is worse than the first 18 weeks of last year. And last year was worse than the year before. The year before was worse. And it's getting worse every single year.
Yeah.
And that trend continues. The point is, we have got to do something different. We've got to ask ourselves, what are we doing differently this time round? Because what we've been doing for the last 15 years hasn't worked. It's getting worse. Exactly. So we've got to think to ourselves, what is it that we can do differently? What is it that we are doing differently? And to be honest, there's not a lot of sign that I can see that we are doing anything different, which means that things are simply going to continue their slow declining trajectory, and things will get worse and worse every year. But I don't want people to feel helpless. There are things that we can do. There are things that Eskom can do. Not alone, on its own, it can't solve the problem. And the problem cannot just be solved by doing more maintenance. Unfortunately, we need new generation capacity. That's in the hands of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and it's also in the hands of customers. Customers can deploy new generation capacity on their plants for their own use, which will relieve Eskom of its burden. And also, if you could wheel power across the grid from the point of generation to the point of consumption, you can significantly reduce the burden on Eskom. So there are things we can do. We've got to get out of this feeling of helplessness, and we've got to get down to action. Stop the talk. We've been talking about it for 15 years, and it's not doing anything.
So what's this talk then, Mr. Yelland, about people saying that Eskom is either considering or already doing, or government is doing, putting sanctions or penalizing people for getting off the grid? There's an amount you have to pay. If you, for instance, with water, get a borehole, suddenly the municipality arrives there with their own little meter to also charge you for that. What is this talk? I mean, that's capitalist.
Listen, I agree with you. What is this nonsense? We should be encouraging and incentivizing people to generate electricity and relieve Eskom of a burden that it's currently unable to meet. Same thing applies to municipalities. Municipality performance is hardly any better. In fact, in many cases, it's worse. And they should welcome and incentivize and encourage people to become part of the solution. Too often they are left they are protecting their own territory, you might say, their own market share. And this is really a dog in the manger attitude. I could understand it if they were performing properly, but they're not. They're constraining the economy of South Africa, and also to some extent they have been inhibiting the uptake of self-generation, embedded generation, distributed generation by customers of electricity who can become part of the solution. So that's a real dog-in-the-manger attitude.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for speaking to us, Mr. Yelland. I hope one day I can get you on the show for you to tell us exactly what we can do as customers to change this negative trajectory to something positive. But thank you very much for today. That is energy expert Chris Yelland. I have a question for you. If we are expected to accept load shedding for 5 hours every day right now, imagine June, July.